Corrupt Bargain is a 2 to 4 player game based on the 1824 presidential election in the US, which had 4 candidates from the same party battling it out for presidency. It's also the first US election where the president was decided by the House of Representatives and not by the people. It's a unique card-driven game with area control elements and a very thematic scoring system that leaves you with a lot to consider. Now, in this gameplay overview, I'm going to change some of the wording to make it a little bit easier for non-Americans to follow. The game does use correct terminology such as the Electoral College, which I always thought was just a school for electricians. I have to ask Cody how he gets those to work. In the game, each state on the map holds a value. This is a number of votes it's worth. Think of these as the victory point value for having the most amount of influence in that state. You have states where the populace vote will win that state's value and the populace influence are represented by the cubes. Other states on the map are capital areas. These states' values will be awarded to the player with the most octagon tokens there, aka politician tokens in that state. In this sense, it's a pretty straightforward area control game. The person with the most relevant tokens in a state when the game ends and the victory points or votes are awarded wins that state's card, which the state cards have their values printed on it. All state cards at the end of the game are handed out to the winners and tallied up for their printed values. But this is where things are a little bit different. The player with the most victory points or votes doesn't always win at this point in time. This tally is only to determine if a player gets over 131 points, which is the majority of votes available. If a player does this and gets the majority, they would win via populace vote. And that would be the end of the game. If no one gets 131 points though, the players move on to a second stage of scoring or voting, which historically is where the election was decided by the House of Representatives. The second stage is called the contingent election. It eliminates the player with the lowest points from the populace voting, leaving the territories they previously controlled up for grabs again by the remaining 3 players. Then the state cards are re-handed out according to politician control of the states. The populace cubes are now not in effect. This time it's the number of states, not the values of them, that counts. If a player gets control of 13 state cards, they win. If no player gets 13, you drop the third player and recount the states again with the remaining 2 players to determine a winner. To put it in perspective, this means that Delaware, which has a value of 3, if it goes to the final scoring, is now just as valuable as New York, whose value is normally 24. This will be in the back of players' minds as the states such as New York and Pennsylvania, which score highly in the first stage of voting, will be subject to a lot of attention throughout the game, but losing sight of the smaller states might see you lose the game if it goes to the second stage of scoring. It's also why on the board you'll see politician or octagon tokens occupy areas that have the square icon to represent that it's traditionally decided by the populace. This is a card-driven game but with a twist. The cards have no operations points themselves. You also don't have a hand of cards to play from each turn. At the beginning of your turn, you'll draw 1 card to play for its event from those available on the track here. The other cards then slide over and a new one comes out. The card's events usually allow the placement or removal of populace cubes or politician tokens in various states or regions on the map. The track itself is where the game houses values for the operations points, so depending on where the card was on the track will dictate how many ops points you get to use. Operations points can be spent to place a populace cube anywhere on the map or a politician octagon anywhere on the map, and you get both the event and the ops points, not one or the other. Because ops points allow for placement anywhere and events are generally designated to an area or a state, at certain times taking a card higher up the track may be advantageous because it offers more operations. Separating the ops points from the cards also removes any overpowered cards that may exist in a traditional CDG. A card here that may be really powerful one game might not be in another. Now, I've seen this kind of track in other games, but personally never in a CDG style game, and I love it. It really is simple, but opens a variety of new and interesting choices as a result. Operations points can be used to do a few other things in the game. I'll touch briefly on one of those in particular called Insight a little later on, but for now let's have a closer look at the event cards. There is another aspect to the cards, the suit, aka the political issue that it's aligned with. The suits are slavery, Western expansion, and trade. Once you play the cards for its event, it's not discarded, you collect them. And when you have a hand of 3 of a kind in your collection, you can play these cards to lock down a state, meaning no more placement of any cubes or politician tokens there from anyone. This is represented by placing a black lockdown cylinder in its location. So keep in mind the scoring. You'd really want to have both a winning populace vote and a winning politician vote before locking it down. Otherwise, and I know this from experience, you might lock down a state with a populace vote win, but if it goes to the contingent election where the octagon presence matters, you've just screwed yourself really. Now, as the states sort of start to lock down, the field of play narrows and things get very congested. The game starts with 23 or 24 states available and less become active as the game progresses because of lockdowns, meaning things get very tight. The other thing to keep in mind is when your opponent is sitting with a hand of 3 collected event cards, there's a good chance they want to lock something down in their turn. You might be able to prevent them from doing it though, and the reason for this is players have to lock down a state at the beginning of their turn, so it's after everyone else has had a chance to play cards and potentially attempt to make an area that they control less attractive for them to lock down by contesting their presence there. It also means suits add another reason to choose a card from the track. If I have 2 trade icons in my hand and my turn comes around and the track looks like this, well, I'm probably going to take this card purely for its trade icon without much consideration for its event or ops values, just because there's currently no other trade icons out on the board. It's also worth mentioning there are what's called insight actions available. These can come from the track where you get the ops points from, some events, and also some operations available to the players throughout the game. Insight basically allows you to take cards from the separate populace and politician decks and on occasion from other players' hands. These cards are collected during the game but not used until players finish all their turns. In a 4-player game, this will be after turn 10. Now, just before scoring occurs, you'll enter a stage called the final push, where players will play these cards to make some final adjustments to the board. This represents some of the backroom dealing and ensures things are never really a sure bet until the very end. Unless of course you've locked down a state, in which case it will remain untouched even by the cards played during the final push. The rulebook makes this game very accessible at only around 7 pages, and it's quite easy for your average gamer to just jump right in without spending much more than an evening learning it beforehand. The rulebook also contains a few pages of historical notes about the election and the candidates themselves. The back of the rulebook has a sequence of play, and there are also 4 player aid cards included in the game. So if you're looking at introducing players to a CDG style game, or political games in general, which is probably my favourite genre, this would be one to investigate further. Also, most election games I've played are 2-player games, with this one being a 4-player game and historically a 4-player race. It separates it from a lot of other election games out there. Now, my experiences with this game have been from 4-player games. I like the player elimination during the scoring, so I'd play it with 3 or 4, but probably not with 2 players. Because I don't want to miss out on that player elimination during the scoring. I think it's really good if it gets to that stage. Now, there is historical context for each event on the cards, but I do think that the artwork could have been made more attractive, and this is a personal thing because I like the traditional CDG style of art with historical artwork or pictures on the cards, as it helps me get drawn into the history a bit more. But it's sort of a rock and a hard place. In this game, the artwork clearly shows the shape of the state it affects. If it's a region it affects, it shows that region, which they're all color-coded. As much as I would love individual art, this system makes it much more accessible for myself and my gaming group because I don't know the whereabouts of most American states. So I often found myself looking to match up states' shapes. And so, as much as historical art would be really good, I can compromise because as is, it's very accessible. Now, one thing I want to mention is tiebreakers. They're really common, but decided by a pretty intuitive process. If a state is tied, it's done by basically determining who has the most politician tokens in that state. If you've still got a tie, then it goes to the most in the region. Still got a tie, then it goes to most on the board, and then there's one to a final, say, but we'll leave that because that doesn't happen that often. When I say ties are common, though, I mean it. If you're smart enough, ties could be worked into your strategy and worked into your lockdown strategy. And I say could be because it's very easy at a glance to see who has control of a state, but a region, the board, as the game nears an end, the board will look a little bit like this. And it's not always as easy at a glance to tell who is in the lead when it comes to the tiebreakers. Now, the inside actions might seem like a bit of a take that element because one inside action is taking politician or populace cards from your opponent's hands. You don't take event cards though, just keep that in mind. There are two reasons it doesn't translate to a take that element in the gameplay though, and one is that those cards that you're taking are only played during the final push and not straight away. For lack of a better term, the hurt of having one taken from yourself will have worn off by the time it's played against you, and secondly, you'll know which card your opponent took and you'll be able to predict its likely outcome during the final push. This game has delivered some innovative mechanisms to the world of the CDG, and some that I think will be replicated in future games. I think designers will take note. All in all, it's a political theme, that's my kind of thing. Ease of access, innovative, interesting choices. It's my kind of game. Thank you for watching.